So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Greg Gwiozda, Vice President with Ipsos Behavioral Science Center. Greg, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. Thank you everyone for joining. We are definitely excited that you're spending the next 30, 40 minutes with us as we talk about, again, like using BSI to navigate these turbulent times. And before we kick off, want to do brief introductions. As Ellen mentioned, I'm Greg Gwiozda. I'm a VP in our Behavioral Science Center. Been with Ipsos about 15 years and was a former professor of political psychology before that. So very interested in how people use information and use it to form opinions and ultimately to make their choices and take action. So these topics are always near and dear to my heart. And before we jump in, though, I'd like to let Sarah introduce herself.
Thanks, Greg. Sarah Middle. I'm a director on the Behavioral Science Center team, and I've been on team for about a year now, a little over a year. My past life, though, I did research in the academic side where I looked at what forms and influences consumers' judgments, what types of decisions make us happiest, right? It's sort of the why behind the buy. And thank you all for being here.
Awesome. Cool. So wanted to give you kind of give everyone a high level roadmap of what we'll cover today. And I start out by, things are turbulent, as we've already mentioned, and people are reining in their costs, they're reining in their spending and things like that. But there are overlooked ways that I think brands can use to create value and appeal, in this environment. And we want to talk about how behavioral science unlocks several strategies and identifies tactics that you can use to meet people where they're at, in the way that they're responding. And what's interesting is, not surprisingly, it's not the first time we've gone through something like this. And there's research that shows the ways people respond to financial stress and financial uncertainty, and it makes them, more predictable. We can identify some of those likely macro trends so that you can, tap into those and think about how you want to position, your brand, or think about the questions that, maybe you should be asking during this time. A little more formally, our agenda is want to just lay the foundation, talk to you a little bit about our team and how we approach behavioral science at Ipsos. BSI is a big term, so I always kind of like to level set and know how we come at it, because it understandably means different things to different people. I want to talk about the context that we're living in, this uncertain world, and then really the meat of our talk will be, the quote unquote the solution. What is the BSI approach to these predictable ways that people responded to this turbulence, and then what are the implications for us? And then at the end we will wrap this up. Our high level takeaways, what we think are key to remember. And then again, time permitting, we will do questions. And as Ellen mentioned, if we don't get to your questions, we will get back to you on an individual basis. So please, fire away any questions you have. We love talking about this stuff. All right, so the foundation. As I mentioned, Sarah and I are part of the Behavioral Science Center here at Ipsos, and we are a group of people who, with a variety of backgrounds. A number of us are former academics with PhDs. We also have a number of people who have been practitioners, client side as well. And we're really seeking to achieve sort of this one large overarching goal, is we want to translate that academic research into what I'd say is more compelling and effective market activations. And there is a really rich literature on a number of topics that is relevant to a lot of our clients, to a lot of brands, to a lot of you out there. And I think just as an industry, we haven't really tapped into it to the way that we can. And I think part of it is people think it's a little sort of esoteric, or a little, or uses words like esoteric, a little, convoluted and hard to activate. And so we want to convert that. We want to take advantage of that knowledge. And so, we get to engage in some really interesting questions. What is the role of emotions and mindsets across a consumer journey? One that I think underlies a lot of it is, how do we create more engaging, basically communications, touch points, whether they're actually our advertisements, but they could be our package, our shelf setup, or things like that. These are all ways in which we are communicating. And we want to make sure that we're optimizing those non-conscious factors. How do we create habits? What are the barriers and the drivers, both the conscious and non-conscious, that lead to our desired goals? So In other words, we want to take a very holistic understanding of the way people behave. And so we look at behavioral science very holistically as well. And we see it as an interdisciplinary field that allows us to better understand these contextual, non-conscious, and I mentioned often hidden and often overlooked drivers of behavior. And we see behavioral science really as an amplifier of what we can do and what we can understand. So we draw on a number of fields. Cognitive psychology helps us understand how people process and store information, what draws attention, and things like that. How do we activate the brain, so to speak, and how do we embed? Social psychology is rich in theories of motivation. What are the things that attenuate our goals, and how does that affect our behavior? And then obviously the social element is, how do we see ourselves as individuals or as parts of groups, and how does that influence, our needs and actions? I think cultural anthropology is one that people don't always necessarily expect to see there, but we want to understand these cultural norms and values that guide us. There's a lot of these expectations or learned associations that influence us. And then behavioral economics, which I think is what a lot of people really first think of from behavioral science. It's what are those heuristics and biases, the decoy effect or loss aversion or things like that influence our choices. The other thing we like to do as we think about this is we want to, put behavior into a larger context. So how do we decide on what to do? And there are really sort of three pillars that ground our actions. There's the knowledge and attitudes that we hold. What do we believe or feel about, a subject matter? But there's also our goals and motivations. What are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to accomplish in that moment? And then that moment kind of alludes to that third factor, is the decision context. How does our environment affect us? And I think it's by accounting for all three of these things that we start to minimize those say-do gaps that I think we are often frustrated by. As an industry, we've done a really good job with knowledge and attitudes, but I think we're not always accounting for the goals and motivations and context. And so just as a quick example, I like to watch movies, and I have a preference for movies, and I have a preference for actors and things like that. I like comedies, probably than action, maybe independent, not really into horror at all or things like that. But it doesn't mean I always pick comedy first. Like I might be on a Friday, I'm kind of burnt out on the week, just want to kind of escape into something, so I'm looking for action. And so that is going to attenuate, my rankings. And then a big question is, do my kids are at that age where they may or may not hang out with me, depending if we're lucky or not. And if they're going to hang out with us, maybe we flip to Marvel. If they're not, might turn to something like John Wick. That's a little more, maybe, intense, if you will. And so all of those things, when you layer in that full understanding, I think helps us get, why the say and do gaps, emerge and how we can better understand that. And I think one thing that's been, I think underappreciated is that context. And so essentially that's really what we want to focus on now, because the context in today's world is pretty heady. It'll come as no surprise, and I'm not even the first person to say it'll come as no surprise, that, that the economy is kind of a big deal these days. Inflation and the economy remain top of mind. Ipsos has a monthly global report survey. We're tracking, people's concerns. And, for the 10th month in a row, inflation has been the #1 concern globally. Here in the US, 48% of Americans cite inflation as their top concern. And nearly 2/3 rate the economic situation as bad as opposed to good. This has real behavioral repercussions. There's an anxiety out there that is feeding into actions. There's a fear of the future. Roughly 1/3 of the people said they couldn't cover a $400 expense if it came up, an unexpected expense. 40% of people report delayed spending, that they are postponing or skipping a high ticket purchase. Again, another 1/3 are curbing their spending, such as canceling a streaming subscription. And 7 in 10 report reprioritizing their spending. Having shifted, their food and entertainment budget to at home. So it might used to be, dinner and a movie out, might be takeout, or even cooking at home, and one of the streaming services that remain. So this raises the obvious question, and what we really want to focus on today is, how can we effectively market within this anxiety-riddled, uncertain context? How do we create that meaning. In other words, I think the question really boils down to, how do we create value? How do we connect with consumers? And I think it's worth going back to, what is the value equation? And we all know this. The value equation is what you get. What are the benefits for what you give? For what is the cost of that item? And then this, raises two very simple tactics that I think we're all familiar with. We can give people more stuff. We can increase our package sizes, or we can, more memory on a phone, or more features, or things like that. Or we could charge less. But these are not ideal, paths for our brand growth and maintaining our own value and our internal goals. But, the nice thing is there's a third option. And it probably comes as no surprise that, it's behavioral science, in our opinion, is that there's a lot of ways that we can craft that perception of the benefit. What people are valuing is going to be attenuated by this context we're in, and we want to make sure that we're really mapping on to that left side of this equation. And so with that in mind, I want to hand this over to Sarah as we start a discussion of, what are the ways that we can really understand the way people are reacting and then really connect with them. So yeah, the floor is yours, Sarah.
Thanks, Greg. So all that to say, we have this context, right, that we are making decisions in that's filled with this sense of uncertainty, right, maybe a lack of stability, a lack of control over our environment. And while there's this sense of uncertainty in the world, scientists have long been interested in, when these times occur, right, how do we react? And for our purposes today, what Greg and I have done is sort of bucketed our reactions and shifts in consumption into two broad buckets. So the first one is consumers start to look for ways to restore a sense of control over their environment, a sense of certainty in their world. The second one is that we stockpile, we shift our priorities, right? But as Greg will talk about a bit more coming up, that definition of what is a necessity is malleable in nature. So we're going to jump into the first bucket here, which is what are the ways that we can cope with these feelings of uncertainty, a lack of sense of control through consumption, right? And through seeking value sort of in different ways. The first one is we stick to the things that we know, right? Our go-tos are the safe options. We know that these brands will deliver. The next thing is we seek variety. And lastly, we have this yearning for nostalgia or the good old days. And we'll talk about each of these in turn, both in terms of sort of the mechanism or why we see this shift happen for consumption, but also what can brands do about it. So let's jump into the first one. So we will talk about our favorite brands, right? It's always good to know who your fanatics are, to be the fan favorite, but this becomes even more important when we have this sense of sort of uncertainty and scarcity in our world. And this is illustrated in a really nice simple experiment. And what they did was they really subtly cued scarcity. They had this first task where consumers were asked, who are participants, were asked to participate in a word identification task. And all they had to do was identify whether each string of words they were presented were in fact a word or a non-word. So the non-word were just random strings of letters, as you see in the example on the bottom of the table. But then they were also shown some neutral words that were in fact words with meaning, and one group saw scarcity related words. So lack, shortage, limited, unavailable. The second group saw the same set of non-words and neutral words, but instead of the scarcity words, they were identifying the words related to abundance. So affluent, rich, plenty, many. So a very subtle cue in their environment that there's either scarcity or abundance. So we have these two groups, right? And then what they did is they said, hey, thank you for your time. As a token of our appreciation, what we're going to do is let you choose 4 gift cards, and then you'll be entered into a drawing. And they really had the drawing, which is important here, right? And they had a collection of different gift cards they could choose from. They could choose 4 of all of the same. They could choose 2 of one, 2 of another, right? 3 of one, 1 of another, whatever combination they wanted. And then they also ranked the appeal of and essentially which gift card was their favorite. And let's see what they found. So those who were cued with those scarcity words, and remember, all they were asked to do was identify the words as words or non-words, were selecting their favorite 3 out of 4 times. So 3 out of the 4 gift cards are 75% of the time. When we looked at those in the abundance condition, those showing those abundance themed words, that drops down by 15%. Between 55 and 60% of the time they were choosing that favorite. So what does this tell us, right, as marketers? Before we get into some examples, I wanted to take a step back and really emphasize why during times of economic turbulence, our initial instinct may be to pull back on advertising, right? Where could we cut costs? But that this may not be the best strategy, not just in the short term, but in the long term as well. And history has shown this. Ipsos Equity Builder tracked brands throughout the last economic recession and looked at their equity ratings, not just during that crisis, but also the post-economic crisis. And what they found was that brands who were willing to evolve their strategy, be dynamic, and continue advertising are really the big winners here. Whereas on the far right side, right, we see that those companies who went dark suffered not just in the short term, but in the long term. It was harder for them to recover and reconnect. And why might this be the case, right? When others are going dark, going silent, your dollars are working harder for you, so to say, right? You have this excess share of voice in terms of the number of messages received, more of them are going to be from you. And sort of further leaning into this, saying we are continuing to be here, we are going to continue to deliver as a favorite brand. Let's think about what messaging we can give around being the trusted choice, being the fan favorite. What points of social proof can we provide? When we say social proof, it's essentially just cues that other people, right, are using our products, enjoy our product, what makes it their favorite. And of course, we have Honey Nut Cheerios here explicitly saying this is America's favorite cereal, right? So give it a try or stick with it for those who are already fan favorites. But I want to show sort of the variety of ways that we can act on this in the marketplace. Starting on the left here, we have Kraft mac and cheese, of course, a favorite in my household, having toddlers. And instead of explicitly saying favorite, they are sure to always communicate in their ads and on their packaging that you are going to get the taste that you love, right? That they are the cheesiest, tastiest option. So really leaning into the sure choice for your mac and cheese. America runs on Dunkin', so similar to the social proof type of claim for cereal that we just saw, or even within the store, we see Quest bars here having a point of purchase signage that says America's favorite protein bar. But what can you do if maybe you're a small business or you work in the world of B2B, right? I think for small businesses, it's a time to remember that you can still be a favorite, right? Even though maybe your target audience is smaller. And we all have our fanatics, right? So identifying who our fanatics are is important. But maybe you have a couple of restaurant locations and you've won favorite in the Bay, right? Well, let's make sure we are shouting that from your window front on your social media, really reinforcing to consumers how you are the best choice when you're having that pizza craving on Friday or you're just too tired to cook. Slack does this in the B2B world really well. Where on their website and in their messaging, they really lean into their favorite status as a B2B solution, right? Businesses also are operating in a world of uncertainty, and those making decisions want to make sure they're making the best decision for their company. So they talk about how 77 of Fortune 100 companies use Slack. So when we pick our favorites, right, it's a way for us to kind of play it safe. It's a way for us to guarantee that we are going to get the benefits that we seek, right? Value guarantee, we can say. Whereas when we seek variety, the mechanism is a little bit different. So we're going to talk a bit about why that might happen, right? So when we are feeling these this sense of uncertainty in the economic environment, maybe even our own personal pocketbooks, right? Then what happens is we sort of start to naturally, even subtly look for ways to take back control, to take back certainty or exercise our agency in our world, in our environment. And one of the ways we could do this is through variety seeking, right? And so instead of buying just the standard 6-pack that has all of the same types of beers, you could build your own 6-pack, right? You are taking back control in a very subtle way, but a powerful way over your consumption. And what they find is that this effect is even greater for those who feel financially stuck. And I think the really important point here is that feeling financially stuck is not specific to low SES status, right? Not actual objective financial status, but actually those who may be objectively well off, maybe have been laid off or were planning to retire but saw their 401k crash recently, right? And they're feeling stuck. They're feeling out of control. And so they're going to be looking for ways to regain that sense of control. So identifying which groups of our consumers are likely feeling the most stuck will be a powerful tool for us. And sometimes, right, we want to think about how can we then offer a means to variety seeking, but also you might be thinking, well, how can we discourage it? Because if consumers are seeking variety, how do we make sure they stick with us? So we have a couple of levers here that you could think about pulling and playing with. The first one is leading into variety seeking by offering multi-packs or multi-buy promotions, right? So buy 4, get 1 free, or buy this multi-pack. If you want to think about leveling up sort of that initiative, it would be an opportunity where they get to build their own, like the beer example on the previous slide. And sort of nicely melding together the idea of favorites, but getting them to fulfill their need for agency within your favorite brand is to offer new flavors, new packs, new variants. A nice illustration here is Goldfish on the slide, offering a red hot flavor version. But the other thing we could think about is what happens when maybe that variety seeking doesn't occur in a single shopping trip, but over time, right? Many people buy clothing on a pretty regular basis, of course, grocery store products. So what we could do is have future discounted promotions to reduce or try to attenuate that variety seeking to keep them coming back to us. I have a couple of examples here. The first one sort of speaking to that last point. I noticed that Target has brilliantly leaned into these free gift card promotions where you spend X amount of dollars in a product category, and then after you have made that initial purchase, you get the gift card, and that gets loaded onto your account. Why? Because they're going to nudge you, right, to come back and spend that money with them next time. So keeping you within the retailer in this case, thinking of the retailer level of reducing variety seeking. I also wanted to showcase an example here from Lay's that I thought was quite brilliant in terms of regaining a sense of control. There's sort of 2 steps to this initiative. The first thing they did was they asked consumers to submit ideas for flavor swaps, or you could think of these as like flavor remixes. And they got to nominate options. And it even says here, our flavor lineup is in your hands, right? You are in control. And then consumers got to vote which ideas actually came to fruition and appeared on the shelf. And so you have Lay's Cheetos, Lay's Doritos, so on and so forth. Extra brilliant because Frito-Lay's, of course, owns all of these brands. So they're finding a way to offer variety, right, but keep you within their family of brands. And then the last example just came out, I think a week ago, I saw the announcement, Reese's came out with animal crackers that were dipped with chocolate and peanut butter. Of course, I haven't had a chance to try these, but want to. So they're expanding their product line, but what they're doing is also offering a nostalgic cue to a snack that probably most of us had at some point in our childhood. And I wanted to end with this one on variety seeking because it's a nice transition into our last section here, which is this yearning for nostalgia. So when we're living through these times of uncertainty, we don't have control, right? One of the things that we do is we sort of wistfully think back to times when we did feel more in control, when we did feel better, more connected, whatever the case is. We have this yearning for the good old days. And the mechanism that is happening here is a bit broader, right? So we've been talking about sort of at the individual level feeling uncertainty. But when we talk about the cue for nostalgia, it's one of the most powerful cues is this feeling of collective stress. Collective stress is this idea that not just I'm going through something and I'm having a rough time, but we as a society are going through something, right? We lived through a pandemic. We're reading headlines daily about layoffs and debt and natural disasters and war, right? And so it's hard to escape this feeling of like we're all going through something. And so this cues nostalgia. Nostalgia is a wistful yearning for a pastime, either to go there in memory or physically to go there, right? Like you probably have a restaurant that is nostalgic for you, or a park or a vacation location, whatever the case is, right? We also have physical places we can literally visit or only in our mind. But nostalgia is a powerful feeling. It helps us feel more connected to others. It rejuvenates us, helps us feel happier, and it helps us feel empathy. I wanted to spend an extra second here on the empathy piece, because not only do we feel empathetic towards others, again, they're going through something too, right? But it can make us feel empathetic towards brands, which I think is interesting here as marketers to think about. And there was a study where what they did was they introduced a price increase, and they either had the announcement with a nostalgic appeal or without. And what they found is that when it was paired with this nostalgic appeal, that people were more likely to infer benevolent motives, right? The business also is facing an inflationary time. They have supply chain issues, especially for small businesses. You know, they're having problems with staffing and uncertainty in their world. So you're more likely to justify the price increase through those means versus a greed motive, right? And so I thought that was a really interesting and important piece here, is that empathy piece, not just for individuals, but for brands as well. And what I really like about the nostalgic lever, right, a lever for us as marketers to think about acting upon, is that there's so many different ways we can think about cueing nostalgia, right? It could be a throwback to a classic flavor. It can be bringing back packaging or logos or jingles, but it can also be, you know, bringing in a star from the 90s or a movie. Of course, who the cue is depends on who your target market is, so we should be aware of that. But all different ways that we can think about cueing nostalgia. Also key life events, historic events, holidays. But I wanted to bring in the recent example, the Super Bowl, right? We probably all noticed how many nostalgic appeals there were during the Super Bowl. And interestingly, Ipsos Creative Excellence identified that the Popcorners from Breaking Bad, right, scored the highest on their index that any ad has scored in the last 3 years. So I think a powerful testament to how effective this can be, and the fact that the nostalgic appeals can be something as short as, you know, a decade old. The last point I wanted to make here is that nostalgia can also be cued in sort of our everyday moments, our routines, our rituals. And so Oreos, right, has a really powerful ritual associated with it. It's usually associated with dunking in milk, right, and having fun or in a moment of enjoyment with someone else. And I see this already starting to take shape in my own life. So my dad now does Oreo cookies as a treat with my son. So he will grow up, right, having Oreos as a nostalgic cue in his life. So it can be really, you know, old throwbacks to flavors, spokespeople, or it could be more recent, or just a cue to sort of an everyday life event. So those are the 3 ways that we can think about, or 3 levers we can think about enacting in terms of restoring a sense of control, right? So leaning into our fan favorite status, offering variety, and cueing nostalgia. And then the next bucket is stockpiling. I'll turn it back over to Greg.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. That stuff's always super cool. Yeah, so the other thing I mentioned is that idea of, again, when things are scarce, necessities become even more valuable. So there's no more basic need. There's more necessity than food. You know, that's Maslow 101 right there. You know, it's a must-have. And when stressed, not surprisingly, you know, we eat more food, and in particular, we seek foods with high calories, more filling foods and things like that. So just as we're trying to stockpile money for security, from an evolutionary standpoint, we are essentially trying to stockpile, you know, again, calories, and unfortunately, or, you know, depending on, our mouth is our bank in that situation. And so this is probably a pretty non-controversial claim, but I think it's still interesting to see how this has been documented and shown, because I think it reinforces how powerful it is. And so in this study, another one of these studies I really love, because it's just a very simple, very elegant study. The researchers wanted to look at the relationship between financial stress and consumption. And so the first thing they needed to do is they needed to manipulate the extent to which people felt stressed. And they did it through simply changing the response options on a question. Everyone was asked, combined, how much money do you have in your checking and savings accounts? Half the people, the one with who would give a perception of being financially fit or healthy, 9-point scale, the range was 0 to 50, 51 to 100, 100 to 150, and the last grouping was, do you have over $400 in your account? And that's not that high of a threshold for most people. And so most people were probably, if not at 9, we're at the high end of that. And so without realizing it, you're sort of scoring yourself if you take that question. You're like, oh, I'm on the high end of the score, without even necessarily being aware that you're thinking that. The second group, other half of the people were given the same question, but again, 9-point scale, 0 to 500, 500 to 2,000, 2,000 to 10,000, 10 to 25, and where the final grouping was, do you have over $400,000, in your savings and checking? And like, I don't have that. Some people might, but more people are going to be towards the bottom end of that scale, and so they're going to realize, maybe I'm not as well off as I thought I was, and so that sense of feeling threatened. Okay, well, they weren't all mean to these people. They also coupled this with a second part of the study and said, after giving those questions, said, we brought you in, we want you to do a candy taste test. Who doesn't want to do that? And so, here's some candy. Try it out. Please eat it. And then, we have some questions for you about, the crunchiness, the meltiness, the overall taste of this. Would love to get your thoughts on that. Now, of course, it wasn't so much the taste that they were interested in, but the consumption. And they had weighed the bowls before the person started the study and then weighed it again afterwards. And they can look at how much actual candy did the people consume. And finding out that those people who felt financially threatened or in that group ate significantly, more volume of candy, 10 grams higher, roughly here. And again, I think it's not massively surprising, but I think what's to me surprising is such a subtle manipulation had such a powerful impact. And as Sarah mentioned, like, we're the real world, and not the feelings of threat are much more tangible and much more out there. And so people are very much likely looking for that sense of satiety and that sense of calories and needs. And so as we're thinking about, marketing our products, and this is again more relevant to foods, obviously, but provide explicit messaging around things like satiety, filling meals and snacks. If you're focusing on health or benefits, it's not the time to focus on, like, say, 50% less sugar, the things that you're taking away. Now is the time to focus on how your products, fuels the body and gives them more. 33 grams of protein in that max bowl. High fibrous, is filling. That whole milk, it supports brain health. The trail mix, simply, power up with this high energy trail mix. And so these are all things that fit into, what you are stockpiling, what you're adding into your, literally into your body. Okay, so we eat more, but hey, Greg, didn't you tell us that we don't spend more, right? I'm pretty sure you told us that, and I did. And I'm really glad that you were paying attention. It makes me, I really appreciate that. And I wasn't lying. There absolutely is true that these things are happening. There are these rational behaviors. There's, for lack of a word, maybe a catch, so to speak. I'm a psychologist, always, a second layer. When it's not necessarily happening universally. We're not necessarily delaying spending across the board. We're not necessarily curbing spending across the board. And that really goes back to the core of the necessities. You still are fighting tooth and nail if you need to pay your mortgage. You definitely are putting groceries on the table. Necessities, quote unquote, by definition, really aren't negotiable. They are things that are necessary. Now, as everyone knows, at least if you have, definitely if you have kids, necessities can be up for debate. Mom, Dad, I really need that phone. I really need this new bag, or things like that. And often looking for that ways to justify. And so it's interesting that stress affects the way that we view our necessities in very interesting ways as well. And this study, again, was just a really cool study that did, again, a really simple manipulation, but really, I thought, some powerful insights. The researchers here at Rutgers, the University of Miami, were interested in looking at this relationship. And so the first thing they did was they recruited people with different levels of sort of uncertainty in their life, so to speak. And this is related to their job. So they looked at people who are established at their job, who'd been their job, for a set period of time. And they also recruited people who had started their job within the last month. So there's, again, a little bit more uncertainty. When you're starting a new job, whether it's your fourth job, whether you've been doing it for 20 years or 20 weeks or whatever, in your career that is, there's always that anxiety, you're meeting new people, you're sort of proving yourself and things like that. They then wanted to manipulate the sense that people might feel stressed. So they asked them basically an open-ended question. And for people they wanted to induce high stress was, think or write about all the things that stress you related to your new job. And get people focused on that. The low stress group was, think or write about just your job in general, what goes on in a typical day. And then they said, we want you to go through a hypothetical spending exercise. Imagine that you are going shopping for clothes today and you're wondering how much money you should spend on cheap clothes versus more expensive, nicer clothes. Of the $300, how much of this money would you spend on the nicer, more expensive clothes? And they gave them a slider. So this person was saying, I would spend, $144 on the nicer clothes. So what did they find? Among people who are established in their job, I think we saw what we would expect to see. People who have experienced high stress said they reported they would spend $40 less on these nicer, more expensive clothes. Probably not really deemed a necessity. You're established in your job. You don't necessarily have to use maybe these other cues to drive your reputation or things like that. I've been at Ipsos 15 years. I might have been one of the first people to start wearing hoodies on our Zoom calls and things like that. If you're new on the job, you might realize that those perceptions are maybe again more malleable. We see the exact opposite here. One thing is everyone in the new job spent more. Collectively, overall, as a group, they spent more than the people who had been established. But the people that really shot up were those who were high stress. Again, that uncertainty about my job, things might be going well. How can I, regain that control, that agency? I can present myself in a way. These clothes become necessities. And so it's very important to think about what is necessity and, that fluidity of it, and what are the ways in which we offer that. So we want to think about our brands, what can we do? We could provide explicit messaging around the need that is served by our products. How do we give them the control they seek in this environment? We can also provide what we call a functional alibi. What can we do that would justify that expense? Our kids are often always doing this to us. I need this because of. A really nice example of this is Beta Brand. They provide high-end, slightly more expensive premium yoga pants. And so these are things that may not necessarily be considered a necessity. They may not necessarily have as greater relevance. But if they can embed themselves in more occasions and see themselves as being more of a need, they can drive, that greater perception of value. So again, they are, now you can wear yoga pants to work, the most comfortable pants you'll ever wear to work. Yoga pants to the office, we don't think that's a stretch. And what they've done is, these are not necessarily things for just certain occasions. These are things for that most, that one of those most important things in your day-to-day life, your job. These become that need. They have that functional alibi. So I know we're coming up at times. As we wrap this up, I want to talk about just sort of the 4 takeaways, and you can just reiterating what we had said. As you think about what you to do for your brands, lean into your favorites. Ask yourself, do you know who your brand fanatics are, and do you know why they love your brand? The reason our favorites are our favorites is we know we like them. And so it takes out that risk. And so spending a little extra on a favorite or things like that is not as much as a risk in uncertain times, because it's not money wasted. Going to something that's different, if it's less expensive, is there some uncertainty. And so our favorites provide that control and that comfort. Enable control via variety. Think about how you can provide choice. And I think, Sarah kind of got this as well, especially for those who are most squeezed or feel most squeezed. Are there channels that, maybe more lower income consumers are shopping at? Have you reduced the shelf options there, which might make your option maybe less appealing than, say, some of your competing brands? What are the ways in which you can give them that control back, that variety that, elevates the value of your brand? We can calm that collective stress with nostalgia. And again, what assets does your brand own? Nike could go back to Mars Blackman and Michael Jordan. Even the documentary, I think, really, was a sense of nostalgia, that Netflix documentary. And as mentioned, the popcorners are not a long-term brand, but you can link to these moments. What are things that you can do to create that feeling of nostalgia? And then lastly, lean into the needs over wants. What functional alibi can you provide to convert a want into a need? Sarah mentioned having some toddlers. We have other people on our team who have recently had kids, and a number of them have talked about, wanting to get a new car. Not sure they really need the new car. I'm not sure they need maybe as expensive as a car, and so maybe this is the time to upgrade. And we need to do this for all these reasons. And to be clear, safety. I mean, I have kids as well. Safety is a fundamental and important issue for any car. But you might be looking at that as there are other things that I need to invest something that's going to be there for the long term. I need to something that I can pass down and has long-term value or things like that. Are there ways that you can justify that? But going into those applications. So I think we're definitely cutting up on time. So I know there's some questions have come in, but I think we're I want to be respectful of everyone's time on that. We will absolutely get back to you on a one-to-one basis. We have greatly enjoyed our time. If you have questions that you have yet to ask, still fire them away. We get back to us. You have our contact information. Want to run you to be on the lookout for the recording. We will be sending out the recording of this for everyone who is here. So if you want to go back and listen to us again, you can also access the white paper, when we send that out as well. So if you weren't able to snag it now and you want more understanding of that, you can get it then. But on behalf of Sarah and myself and all of Ipsos, again, greatly appreciate you taking this time with us and letting us, again, talk about this topic that we think is both really fascinating and I think really obviously timely. Thank you.